All right, deep divers, back again for another plunge into some seriously deep philosophical waters. Knowing how much you all love to wrestle with the really big questions.
Absolutely.
Today, we're taking on a thinker who grappled with the very fabric of reality itself. Baruch Spinoza.
Oh, a good one.
We're diving headfirst into his modal metaphysics,
Right.
his ideas on what absolutely has to be,
Okay.
what just might be, and what simply is.
Yeah.
Buckle up, because this is Spinoza, so get ready for a wild ride.
This is going to be dense.
To navigate this conceptual maze,
Yes.
we're using the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on Spinoza's modal metaphysics as our trusty guide.
A good choice.
Our mission today, fellow philosophers, is to unpack Spinoza's core arguments about modality,
Okay.
to scrutinize his claims,
Yeah.
explore the different ways people interpret his work,
Yeah.
and of course grapple with the challenges his ideas pose.
Definitely.
By the end, we'll have a much clearer, more nuanced understanding of Spinoza's thoughts.
All right.
And what they mean for those big philosophical questions we're always pondering.
The big ones.
So let's jump right in.
Let's do it.
Now, one of the most fascinating and often the most challenging parts of Spinoza's modal view is his strong leaning towards necessitarianism. He famously stated,
Okay.
"In nature, there is nothing contingent, but all things have been determined from the necessity of the divine nature to exist and produce an effect in a certain way,"
So everything is predetermined.
adding that things just couldn't have been any different.
Wow.
This definitely clashes with our everyday feeling that many things could have turned out differently.
I mean, yeah, it does.
Like, imagine all the choices you've made in life.
Exactly.
All the little things that led to this very moment.
Yeah.
Did they have to happen exactly this way?
Right.
Spinoza seems to think so.
That's a big pill to swallow.
It is, but to understand how he gets there, we got to start with his concept of substance. Right?
That's the foundation.
So Spinoza claims that every possible substance necessarily exists.
Okay.
And this is step one in his argument for substance monism,
Which is,
the idea that there's only one substance, and that's God.
so everything comes from God.
Exactly. But he builds this argument in two stages.
Okay.
First, every possible substance necessarily exists.
Right.
And second, that God is the only possible substance.
So he's laying the groundwork.
Precisely.
Let's break down that first stage then.
Absolutely.
Every possible substance necessarily exists.
What's the driving force behind this claim?
Well, Spinoza leans heavily on the principle of sufficient reason.
PSR.
You know this one well, being the philosopher that you are.
Of course, the PSR, the idea that every fact needs a reason.
Or an explanation.
If something exists, there's got to be a reason why.
And it doesn't exist, there's a reason for that too.
And Spinoza connects this directly to his understanding of causation.
Okay.
He sees causes not just as events that happened before,
Oh, yeah.
but as the very ground for their effects.
So a cause is like the explanation for its effect.
Exactly. The cause is what makes the effect necessary.
Interesting.
And then he takes us to a whole other level with the idea of causa sui.
Causa sui, self-cause, that's a tricky one.
It is, but what's the significance for Spinoza?
Well, for Spinoza, when we talk about causation, we're talking about this involvement.
Involvement.
Yeah, like a conceptual link.
Okay.
So when he defines causa sui, he means something whose very essence involves existence.
So its nature can't be conceived of without also conceiving of it existing.
Exactly.
So it's not just about something causing itself in time, but about its very being requiring existence.
Right, like its definition includes existence.
And he argues that existing substances have to be self-caused.
It means they necessarily exist.
Because if a substance existed, it would need a cause, right?
Yeah.
But substances are independent.
So they can't be caused by something else.
So the cause has to be within the substance itself.
Hence, self-caused.
And if the very idea of the substance includes existence,
Then it can't not exist.
it has to exist.
I'm following so far.
Good. Now let's flip this around.
Okay.
What about substances that don't exist?
Right.
What does Spinoza say about them?
He applies the same logic.
So their non-existence must also have a reason.
A reason found within the substance itself.
And he concludes that these non-existing substances are impossible.
Impossible.
They contain a contradiction.
Like a square circle.
Exactly. Their own definition prevents them from existing
So either a substance exists necessarily,
because its essence involves existence.
or it's impossible because it contradicts itself.
And that leads to his claim that every possible substance necessarily exists.
There are no maybes?
No, it's either yes or no.
That's quite a statement.
It is, but now he takes this even further.
Oh, boy.
How does he get from every possible substance necessarily existing to God being the only possible substance?
Right, that's a big leap.
This is stage 2 of his monism argument, and the PSR is still crucial. So Spinoza defines God as a substance made up of infinite attributes,
Infinite attributes.
each one expressing an eternal and infinite essence.
That's a lot to unpack.
It is, but the key here is that God is the most real substance,
The most real.
with maximum power, and therefore the strongest reason for existing.
So if there were other substances,
They would have less power, less reason to exist.
then that would be a problem for the PSR?
Exactly, because there wouldn't be a sufficient reason why those less powerful substances exist instead of God.
So God, being the most perfect, has to exist.
And not only that,
Yeah.
Spinoza argues that God's existence rules out any other independent substances
Because.
because God is absolutely infinite. There's
Okay.
no room for anything else to exist on its own.
So God is the one and only.
The unique and only possible substance.
This raises some interesting questions, though.
Oh, definitely.
Like, does Spinoza even show that his concept of God is possible
That's a good point.
before claiming it's necessary?
It's a classic philosophical challenge.
And what about the idea that a substance only has one main attribute?
Descartes, right.
Yes, Spinoza's God has infinitely many.
That's a huge departure.
It is.
How would he address these challenges?
Well, I think Spinoza would emphasize the independence of each attribute.
So thought and extension are totally separate,
Exactly. Each one is a complete way of understanding the same substance.
and there's no contradiction between them.
No, they don't overlap or interfere with each other.
And as for why infinite attributes equal perfection,
Mhm.
Spinoza might say perfection involves both unity and diversity,
So God is one substance.
but expressed in infinitely many ways.
That's a pretty cool concept.
It is, but despite all these debates,
Right.
Spinoza ends up with this idea of God as the single necessary substance.
Okay, but where do we fit in?
The age-old question.
I mean, we're not substances, are we?
Not in Spinoza's world.
So what are we?
We are modes.
The modes or affections of God.
Affections of God. That
Seems
sounds, yeah, a little bit. I know, it's a mind-bending concept.
It is.
In his Ethics, Spinoza writes,
Okay.
whatever is in God, and nothing can be or be conceived without God.
So everything is connected to God somehow.
Intimately connected.
But what does it even mean to be in God?
That's a great question, and it's led to a lot of discussion.
I bet.
One interpretation is causal dependence,
Meaning
that modes exist and have properties because of God.
they depend on God for everything.
Exactly. But some argue this downplays the connection.
So what are the other interpretations?
Well, there's the idea of particularized accidents or tropes.
Tropes.
Like instead of saying the coin is circular,
Mhm.
we're talking about the unique circularity of this specific coin,
And that unique circularity is a mode.
inherent in God.
So it's not just a general property.
Right, it's a specific instance of that property.
Interesting.
And then there's the emphasis on the conceptual dimension.
Like causation is conceptual involvement.
Exactly. So modes are in God because they're conceived through God.
So there's this conceptual link.
It's all very interconnected.
It is. But no matter how we interpret this inherence,
Yeah.
it still seems hard to reconcile with the individuality of things.
It does, but that's part of what makes Spinoza so fascinating.
He challenges our basic assumptions.
Absolutely.
Now, Spinoza also seems to have a view on the sheer number of these modes,
He does.
the principle of ontological plenitude.
POP.
Yeah, the idea that everything that can exist does exist.
So, no unrealized possibilities.
None.
Why does he think this?
Well, it goes back to the PSR.
Of course.
If there were possible modes that didn't exist,
What would be the reason for their absence?
exactly, and for Spinoza, there wouldn't be one.
So the universe is brimming with everything that could possibly be.
That's a lot of stuff.
It is. And you might think this leads straight to necessitarianism for modes, too.
I mean, if everything that can exist does exist.
It seems like there's no room for contingency.
Right, no alternatives.
But the SEP entry points out that even with this fullness, contingency might still sneak in.
How so?
Well, even if the total number of modes is fixed,
Mm-hmm.
there could still be different combinations.
Different arrangements of the same piece.
Oh, exactly. Like imagine all the possible ways to arrange the atoms in the universe.
All right,
The total number might be fixed.
but the specific configuration could change.
So the fullness of existence doesn't equal the necessity of each specific thing.
Okay, so there's still room for debate.
Absolutely.
So how does Spinoza approach the question of whether modes are necessary or contingent?
This is where he distinguishes between infinite and finite modes.
Right.
Infinite modes flow directly from God's attributes.
Like thought and extension?
Exactly, while finite modes don't.
So what are some examples of infinite modes?
He mentions motion and rest,
Okay.
and the intellect absolutely infinite.
That's a mouthful. It is.
And he distinguishes between two types of infinite modes.
Right. Immediate and mediate.
Immediate, what's the difference? Immediate ones are like direct expressions of God's attributes.
So things like extension itself.
Exactly. While mediate ones are more like structures derived from those.
Structure.
Like think of the face of the whole universe.
the totality of all physical things.
Yes, that's immediate infinite mode.
So these infinite modes are like the fundamental aspects of reality.
Directly connected to God's essence.
And Spinoza argues that if something follows necessarily from something that necessarily exists,
Like God.
then that something also necessarily exists.
This is the modal transfer principle.
So it transfers necessity down the line
Exactly. And since infinite modes follow from God,
through this necessary chain.
all existing infinite modes exist necessarily.
They have to exist.
And he also argues there can't be non-actual infinite modes.
You mean?
Infinite modes that could exist but don't.
Why not?
Again, it goes back to the PSR.
Of course.
If such a mode were possible,
And compatible with the existing ones?
there wouldn't be a reason why it doesn't exist.
So for Spinoza, it must exist.
Exactly.
Okay, so the infinite modes are on the side of necessity.
Firmly.
But what about the finite modes?
The everyday stuff we
The
experience.
tables and chairs.
Our thoughts and feelings.
Right, all the finite things.
That's where the big debate about Spinoza's necessitarianism lies.
Because
Because in his Ethics, Spinoza says finite modes don't come from the absolute nature of God's attributes.
why not?
If they did, they'd be eternal and infinite like the attributes themselves. Instead, they come from God or an attribute as affected by another mode.
So finite things come from other finite things,
And he describes this infinite chain of finite modes
each one determined by the one before it.
stretching back forever.
So it's not a direct line from God to each finite thing,
No, it's more indirect.
which might leave room for contingency,
That's the heart of the debate.
because this chain of finite causes,
Might suggest a kind of determinism,
where events are determined by what came before.
but not necessarily necessitarianism.
The idea that things couldn't have been otherwise?
Exactly. And this leads to what's called the problem of the gap
The gap.
between this chain of finite causes.
And Spinoza's claim that everything is caused by God. How do we bridge that gap?
Well, Edwin Curley proposes that finite modes are only partly determined by other finite modes.
Partly.
They're also partly determined by infinite modes,
Which are?
the laws of nature.
So there's this influence from God's nature,
There are these laws.
but not a direct necessitating influence.
So there's room for some contingency.
I like that idea.
It's a clever solution.
But doesn't it raise another problem?
It does with the PSR.
Right, if finite modes are only partly necessitated,
By the necessary infinite modes.
and partly by contingent finite modes,
Then what's the ultimate explanation for this particular sequence of contingent events?
where did it all begin?
That's the challenge.
So we're back to the drawing board.
Well, not quite.
Why?
There's another interpretation, Don Garrett's second pass.
Second pass.
Yeah, he takes a different approach.
And this one leans more towards necessitarianism.
It does.
How so?
Garrett argues that the entire collection of finite modes follows necessarily from God's absolute nature,
The whole shebang.
even if individual finite modes, when considered alone, don't.
So the whole is necessary
But the parts might not be.
when considered individually.
Exactly.
But if we look at those parts,
As part of the complete interconnected system,
they also become necessary.
because they're part of this necessary whole.
That's a tricky concept.
It is, but the key is the level at which we're conceiving things.
Whether we see things in isolation or as part of the bigger picture.
And that influences their modal status.
So how we think about things affects whether they're necessary or contingent.
In Spinoza's system, yes.
That's a pretty profound claim.
It is. It connects our understanding to the nature of reality itself.
It does.
And Garrett's interpretation says that the necessity isn't in each individual finite mode itself.
When we look at it alone.
Right, but it emerges from their place in the whole system.
Which flows from God.
Exactly.
But this view also faces some challenges, right?
It does. Like, how can the whole series be necessary?
If the individual parts don't seem to be in the same way,
That's a tough one to crack.
it is. But it leads us to think about the very nature of modality for Spinoza.
What does he think about necessity, possibility, contingency?
Right. How do they work?
And he doesn't just state what is or isn't possible.
He tries to explain why.
Exactly. For Spinoza, modality isn't some unexplained feature of reality.
It has reasons.
All modal claims, whether something's necessary, possible, or contingent.
Have explanations rooted in substance and its modes.
And he demonstrates this with God's existence.
Okay.
He says God's existence is necessary because of God's essence.
His very nature.
Specifically, the involvement relation between the concept of God and the concept of existence.
Meaning?
That for God to exist is part of what it means to be God.
It's built into his definition.
And he uses this idea of conceptual connection to explain other necessary truths.
Like the angles of a triangle always adding up to 180 degrees.
Exactly. The necessity comes from the concepts themselves.
So everything follows from God because it's conceptually connected to God.
Whose very essence involves existence.
And contingency happens when there's no such connection.
If we conceive of something without that link back to God's being,
It appears contingent.
right, even if ultimately it's not.
And this explains the modal transfer principle.
Because necessity and following from
Are both based on these conceptual relationships.
So necessity gets passed along these chains of conceptual involvement.
It all comes back to concepts.
With Spinoza. Yes.
And that highlights that for him, modality isn't just about what exists in all possible worlds.
It's also about how things are conceived.
So our understanding plays a role.
A crucial role in determining something's modal status.
So going back to the debate about necessitarianism.
And non-necessitarianism.
Could this conceptual account of modality offer a way to reconcile them?
It might.
How so?
Well, Garrett's interpretation
The one where finite modes are necessary when viewed as part of the whole system.
fits well with this idea of conceptual grounding.
When we see a finite thing as connected to God,
Its necessity becomes apparent.
at least in principle.
However, Spinoza was pretty pessimistic about our ability to grasp these complete conceptions.
We're limited.
Our limited perspective leads us to see things in isolation,
And that makes them seem contingent.
even if they're ultimately not.
So we experience contingency because of our limited understanding.
Even if everything's actually necessary.
That's a tough one to wrap your head around.
Yes.
But it does suggest that both views might be true in a way.
Necessitarianism at the highest level.
And non-necessitarianism at our limited level.
It depends on how we're conceiving reality.
Fascinating.
Now, finally, there's the question of the ground of modality.
The foundation of it all.
Why are some things possible, others necessary, others impossible?
Right.
And in Spinoza's time,
This was tied to debates about God's will and intellect.
but Spinoza, he goes his own way.
Of course he does.
He rejects the traditional views of God's will and intellect as separate from his essence.
So how does he explain it?
He proposes that non-existing modes, the possibilities, are grounded in God's actual attributes,
So the essences of everything that could be.
are already contained in God's nature.
So possibility isn't external to God.
No, it's internal.
It's part of who he is.
And this challenges the view that God grounds possibilities.
Without embodying them all.
Spinoza questioned how God could create properties he didn't possess.
That's a good point.
So for Spinoza, possibility is limited by God's actuality.
What is possible is based on what God actually is.
Exactly.
Wow, that's a lot to process.
It is. But hopefully this deep dive into Spinoza's modal metaphysics has given you a better understanding of his ideas.
It's a complex system,
But it's full of fascinating arguments and insights.
and it raises some really big questions.
Like, what are the implications for our understanding of free will?
If everything's necessary.
Do we even have choices?
And what about ethics?
Do moral judgments make sense in a world where everything is predetermined?
And how does this affect our understanding of explanation itself?
If there's no contingency, can we ever truly explain why things happen the way they do?
These are questions worth pondering.
They are, and we encourage you to keep exploring Spinoza's work.
And the philosophical discussions it continues to spark.
Who knows, you might even come up with your own interpretation.
It's a journey worth taking.
Until next time, deep divers.
Keep diving!